so happy to welcome you all to this event with Dr. Deborah Bergoffen, our visiting Tucker Boatwright Professor in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And I'd like to, in particular, thank the School of Arts and Sciences and our Dean's Office, Dean Rankin, for helping us with this resource of a visiting Tucker Boatwright Professor, not just in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, but with a focus on gender violence. And this is part of our WGSS initiative to infuse in our cultural consciousness and throughout our curriculum attention to gender violence, its causes, its effects, and its solutions. And this is our inaugural event with Dr. Bergoffen, but as many of you might know, she's teaching a seminar on the shame of sexual violence. Some of you might be enrolled in that class currently. And we're also having events throughout the semester that focus on gender violence that Dr. Bergoffen will be involved in. So on March 1st, we're having a gender violence panel that involves many students as well as faculty and members of our community that Dr. Bergoffen will be on, along with Mariana Mendez and Erica Damer leading the way. And then we'll have an art installation on trafficking that will be in the middle of Stern Plaza between Ryland Hall and Weinstein Hall, anchoring the Robbins statue in the middle of Stern Plaza. And this art installation is called Bought and Sold, focusing on human trafficking. And Dr. Bergoffen has brought this to us with the artist Kate Chernish. And so that installation will happen on March 28th, and it'll be up until April 16th. And we'll have a launch panel event for that on April 2nd, where we'll have Professor Datta from the Poli-Sci Department, Dr. Browder from the English and American Studies program, and then a community member, Bonnie Price, who's teaching an Osher seminar on human trafficking and works as a forensic nurse at Bon Secours, focusing and specializing on trafficking. So I hope you'll continue to look at our WGSS calendar and our advertising for these events throughout the course of the semester and help us build this community of consciousness around gender violence. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Liddell McWhorter, our Stephanie Bennett Smith Endowed Chair in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And Dr. McWhorter will introduce Deborah Bergoffen. But first, let me say a few things about Dr. McWhorter. I'm guessing most of you know who she is because she's so fabulous, and you all are so fabulous. I'm sure you've connected with her by now. But she is our leader, intellectual leader in WGSS, and she's also a professor in environmental studies. And her focus on queer theories, environmental ethics, has made monumental and groundbreaking contributions to our curriculum. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. McWhorter for her introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary Lee. She's always too generous, although I do like the idea of communing in our fabulosity.
Yes.
Well, when Dr. Mifsud invited me to give this introduction, I eagerly agreed because I remembered something that makes this day and this month of February very special for me. It was 30 years ago this month, February of 1988, that I met Deborah Bergoffen. Do you remember that? We were both attending the meetings of the International Association for Philosophy and Literature at Notre Dame, which is not the best place in the world to meet people, I have to say. In those days, there were so few women in philosophy that it was possible for all of us to eat together at one table. It was a pretty big table, but it was one table. So Judith Butler organized a lunch for all of us, and I had the good fortune to be seated across from Deborah Bergoffen. From that time on, we've stayed in touch. I followed her work, then on Simone de Beauvoir, with a focus on sexuality and generosity in relationship and on embodiment. And I recommend to you her early book, The Philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, Gender Phenomenologies, Erotic Generosities. And in the more recent years, she's worked on gender and violence and published her book on international human rights, sexual violence, and genocide entitled Contesting the Politics of Genocidal Rape, Affirming the Dignity of the Vulnerable Body. All of Deborah's work is careful. She's always carefully attentive to the text and the voices with which she works. She listens deeply, searchingly, which makes her not only a superb scholar, but also a truly good friend. Her deep attention and care to the text is complemented by her care for her readers and auditors. Her prose is clear, respectful, sometimes sparse, and as a result, amazingly powerful, which you're about to experience. She brings that attention to her students and her younger colleagues as well. The WGSS faculty and students are truly blessed to have her here with us for this semester. Deborah Bergoffen earned her PhD from Georgetown University in 1974, a time when there were even fewer women in philosophy than there are today, or in 1988. That fact in itself should give you a sense of how remarkable Deborah is. She retired from George Mason University after many years of teaching not long ago, and has since held the Bishop Hamilton Philosopher in Residence at American University, where she regularly offers graduate seminars. Her CV reveals that her retirement has hardly been restful. In just the last 6 years or so, not only has she published a book, but she's also co-edited 3 volumes and published 17 single-authored articles. She is a prolific as well as a consummate scholar. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Bergoffen and in thanking her for being with us.
Thank you for that just wonderful introduction, and for not saying all the other things you know about me. And I want to begin by thanking everyone who's been involved in inviting me here. It has been such a joy to get to know you, to work with you. It's been a real pleasure. My talk this afternoon is, I suspect, and actually hope, going to be somewhat controversial. And so I want to ask you to give me the generosity of listening with open minds and ears, and then thinking about whether you want to accept the implications of what I'm saying or not. You can think about this talk as framed by 4 questions. 1, who are the comfort women? Who are they according to the Japanese? Who are they according to themselves? Who are they according to the tribunal in which they appeared as accusers? First question. Second question. Why were the crimes against humanity perpetrated against them never prosecuted at the official trials after World War II at Tokyo and Nuremberg? I don't think any of, well, maybe that's got some controversial stuff. Then, how is the status of the prostitute involved in those first 2 questions? And in what ways does the status of the prostitute affect all women? And finally, the question I end with, what next? Confronting misogynist injustice, the case of the World War II comfort women. Let me just step back and say comfort women in the written paper is always in quotation marks to indicate it's a very problematic name. Okay. On December 4th, 2001, the Women's International Criminal Tribunal on Military Sexual Slavery by Japan found that Japan's World War II so-called comfort stations were slave and rape camps. It convicted the Emperor Hirohito and 9 other high-ranking Japanese military officers and government officials of crimes against humanity. Now, this is a people's tribunal. A people's tribunal is called together and organized by people, not by any state, not by any legal system. So, having no legal standing, this people's tribunal could neither secure an apology nor demand reparations from Japan. It could, however, do something that official courts can rarely do. It could peer through the cracks of the legal system, expose the law's gender biases, and contest the state's exclusive right to identify and prosecute criminal behavior. The Bertrand Russell War Crimes Tribunal was much earlier and a very publicized moment of this people's court power. It prosecuted the United States for war crimes in its conduct of the Vietnam War. So you want to see this tribunal in a similar kind of light. Accusing official courts of rarely applying the legal definitions of slavery to situations where women are raped and treated as sexual property. This People's Tribunal put the law on trial, calling on the women to testify in their own voice. It rejected the right of men to either silence women or distort their words by speaking for them. Staging a trial that operated in accordance with accepted standards of precedent, testimony, and evidence. The tribunal's internationally recognized judges showed what the law could do, made the case for what the law should do, and held it accountable for what it did not do. It called official courts to account for failing to prosecute wartime sexual assaults against women as crimes against humanity. Though officially, the emperor and the Japanese military and government were in the docket. Reading the tribunal transcripts, it becomes clear that there is another defendant in this case, patriarchal values. Asking why it took 50 years and an unofficial proceeding to address the Comfort Women case, the tribunal found that the gender biases of the World War II criminal courts and the misogyny of Japanese and allied cultures, that these were responsible for Japan's escape from censure. This bias and misogyny is crystallized in the figure of the prostitute. Passing the women off as prostitutes, the brutality of the comfort stations was normalized. Silenced by the shame of being stigmatized as prostitutes, the women secured the immunity of the system's architects. When the Comfort Women broke their 50-year silence, they rejected Japan's claim that they were prostitutes. They insisted on being identified as sex slaves. Making the case for their dignity in this way, however, the vilification of the prostitute that enabled the comfort station system to flourish was left untouched. For the unintended consequence of the Comfort Women's refusal to be called prostitutes is that it implies that if they were prostitutes, their abuse would have been justified. The time has come to change the rules of the game, to expose the way that the degradation of the prostitute allows today's sex traffickers, like yesterday's comfort station organizers, to escape condemnation by passing the women off under their control as whores, degraded women who deserve what they get and get what they deserve. It is time to insist that no woman should have to distance herself from the prostitute to bring charges of war crimes, rape, or sexual abuse. It is time to say that prostitutes, like all women, have a right to respect and sexual integrity. Time to create a time when the threat of being called a prostitute could no longer be used to silence, degrade, shame, and police women. Where calling a woman a prostitute lost its value as a get-out-of-jail-free card for those who traffic, enslave, women. The People's Tribunal as a mime, a mimic. The Women's Tribunal rendered its judgment 9 months after the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, found 3 Bosnian Serb soldiers who raped and sexually enslaved Muslim women and girls guilty of crimes against humanity and of violating their human right to sexual integrity. Its echo of the ICTY is no accident. Survivors of the comfort stations and the Bosnian Serb genocidal rapes met at the UN 1993 Human Rights Conference in Vienna. The Women's Tribunal's Chief Justice was the former president of the ICTY. One of the tribunal's judges served on the ICTY. The chief prosecutor was legal advisor for gender-based crimes at the ICTY and at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTY. Noting these connections, the Women's Tribunal may be seen as mimicking the official legal system to pursue the ICTY demand that the right to sexual integrity be secured for all women. Seen as a mime, a technique associated with silence, the Women's Tribunal may be seen as confronting the matter of women having their experiences of rape and sexual assault being filtered through men's words. Miming courtroom procedures to transform silenced victims into vocal accusers, the tribunal exposed the ways that is currently written and applied. The law secures the authority of men's desire. Its claim, the law's claim, to objectivity and rationality cannot be sustained. Legal principles that are in plain sight and readily applied in cases of labor slavery and torture disappear when it comes to prosecuting sexual violence. In using the law to track the law's willful neglect of crimes against crimes against women, which in this case are crimes against humanity. The tribunal does not, however, reject the rule of law. It affirms the rule of law. It affirms the importance of the rule of law as it takes up the project of reorienting the law. Silenced, slandered, and shamed by a name. Being called to testify before the tribunal, the comfort women were recognized as possessing what Hannah Arendt identifies as the fundamental human right, the right to have rights, the right to speak in public and to have one's words count. When they took the stand, the comfort women demanded the right to protect their identities. This was not, as is so often the case in rape and sexual assault trials, a matter of protecting the identity of an individual woman by concealing her name, but of protecting the status of a group of women from the slander of a name. The women insisted that they were not comfort women, the euphemism for prostitutes who agreed to support the time-honored tradition of maintaining military morale by sexually rewarding soldiers for their service and bravery. Heeding the women's call and refusal to be called prostitutes, the tribunal offered them two alternatives: forced prostitutes or sexual slaves. The women rejected the name forced prostitute. Forced or not, they said, the derogatory connotations of the term prostitute would prevail. They insisted on being called sex slaves, citing the fact that international law recognizes forced prostitution as sexual slavery. The tribunal accepted the name the women chose for themselves. Legitimating the women's decision, it found that, and I'm quoting the tribunal, the negative connotations of the term prostitute reflect profoundly discriminatory attitudes toward women. Anyone who opens a dictionary finds the court's statement confirmed. Though a prostitute is first defined as, quote, a woman who engages in sexual intercourse for money, this non-judgmental description of women's agency is immediately undermined when whore, defined as a person who engages in promiscuous sex, is given as the synonym for prostitute. A third definition, describing the prostitute as a person who willingly uses his or her talent or ability in a base and unworthy way, usually for money, compounds the discriminatory connotations. The prostitute, originally described as a woman engaged in a simple commercial transaction, but subsequently identified as base and unworthy as a whore, emerges as a morally problematic person. Though selling sex, like other commercial transactions for profit, involves several buyers, here, dealing with more than one buyer carries the unsavory tag promiscuous. I don't know that Apple would like to have that term applied to them, as they acquire lots and lots of customers. Oh, you're such a promiscuous corporation. Whatever argument may be made for the fact that promiscuous, base, and unworthy are not entailed in the primary definition of the word prostitute, the lives of the comfort women and the experience of women who work as prostitutes make it clear that the hierarchies of dictionary definitions are irrelevant in a world in which these definitions flourish. They infect each other. And I think it's interesting to know that women who work as prostitutes don't call themselves prostitutes. They call themselves sex workers. That gives you a sense of the power of that term. Because the prostitute is seen as choosing an unworthy way of life, she is said to get what she deserves and deserves what she gets. Not exactly a free pass for those who traffic in women, but close. For if they can identify their women as prostitutes, they can count on the way this name protects them, the traffickers, from social, political, and legal censure. Under the terms of the first definition, a prostitute is a woman who asserts her agency. She exercises her power to engage in a commercial transaction, to sell a body for profit. Under the terms of the subsequent definitions, this agency is degraded and depraved. Now, we need to ask the question, why are women who exercise their agency accused of being immoral? Why are those subsequent definitions used to vilify women's use of agency? Now you'll say, well, it's only a matter of sexual agency. No big deal. But even if you think that's no big deal, if you look closer, you can make sense of the fact that women who use their agency in non-sexual ways were degraded as whores. Meredith Tax reports that the New York 1909 striking shirtwaist workers, women, were vilified as prostitutes. Luba Cabezas tells us that in Cuba, the stigma attached to sex workers can be hurled against any woman who deviates from the narrow definition of what counts as a good woman. Zenwe Masinsto found that South African women who resisted apartheid were called prostitutes and sexually abused. By calling the comfort women prostitutes, the Japanese government argues for their agency. They chose to do this willingly to escape Japan's culpability. We're not responsible for women who use their agency to degrade themselves. Calling them prostitutes in order to establish the women's degenerate use of agency, Japan discredits the women's testimonies. Immoral women lie. It didn't happen. We are not accustomed to putting the prostitute at the forefront of the feminist agenda. We do not usually identify sexual pleasure and the fantasies that structure it as central to our sense of self-respect. Drusilla Cornell challenges this marginalization. Eroticism, she says, is not simply a private bedroom matter. It is a political issue. As Cornell sees it, the denigration of the prostitute plays a key role in the sexual politics that alienates women from their humanity by reducing them to objects of men's fantasies. Cornell ties our sense of self-respect to three conditions: bodily integrity, access to symbolic forms that allow us to express our individuation, symbolic forms, ideas, language, words, and protection of the imaginary domain. That's a really interesting one. Asserting that sexuality is formative to our individuation, to our sense of who we are, and that existing at the mercy of another's fantasies compromises our access to the symbolic forms that allow us to express our individuation. In other words, if I'm the object of your fantasy and those fantasies define who I am, then I don't get to define who I am. My fantasies, no place here. Okay. So Cornell contends that protecting the sexual imaginary is a human right. Bringing this argument to the issue at hand, she finds that so long as the shame and degradation that accrues to the prostitute is used to stereotype women as the object of men's desire, women's status as fully human will be compromised. And I think I'm seeing the comfort women as a clear validation of this. Now, okay, so we've got that lined up. New piece. Qualifying as a real victim with rights to justice. Okay. How do you get your claims that you have been dealt with unjustly? How do you get them heard? Okay. The sexual politics of the prostitute what Cornell called sexual politics of the prostitute, is in place in what Laura Stempel calls a misogynist victimhood scale. According to this scale, only an innocent person qualifies as a victim. Being identified as a prostitute, a person who willfully degrades herself, puts you at the bottom, if not totally outside, of the victim scale. As innocent, you deserve sympathy. You have a right to be heard, your words are credible. As a culpable prostitute, you forfeit your right to sympathy and your right to be believed. Immoral women lie. The tribunal, accepting the women's refusal to be called prostitutes, implicitly accepted the terms of this victim hierarchy. Citing international law, the tribunal defines slavery as, quote, the condition or status of a person over whom any or all the powers attaching to the right of ownership are attached. Finding, this is what I'm focusing on here, that forced labor does not necessarily entail exercising ownership over a person, whereas forced sex does. The tribunal found that forced sex, and you'll hear Cornell here, is a form of objectification disproportionately visited upon women and rooted in the fundamental failure to treat women as full persons. In immunizing the comfort women from the slander of the name prostitute, however, the tribunal upholds the misogynist victimhood scale. By tying sex to personhood, the tribunal makes it possible to condemn selling sex as a threat to personhood. Selling sex equals selling your personhood. And to vilify the prostitute for degrading herself by misusing her agency. The tribunal's distinction between the use of a body for labor, which does not involve one's status as a person, and the use of a body for sex, which does, reflects and reinforces current ideas about proper and improper uses of one's body. Its explicit legal reasoning reveals the implicit assumptions in our refusal to equate freely chosen sex work with other forms of labor. These assumptions appear outside the courtroom in the different ways that we judge the person who sells her labor, the domestic worker, and the person who sells her sex, the prostitute. The domestic worker is respected because her labor is not seen as selling herself. It is not seen as compromising her dignity. The prostitute, however, is shunned. Selling her sex is seen as putting a price on herself and as a willful denigration of her status as a person who therefore is unworthy of sympathy or justice. The prostitute's diplomatic life. In 1993, Japan's chief cabinet minister, Yogi Kono, acknowledged Japan's moral responsibility for the comfort stations. Unlike the tribunal that hoped that its moral condemnation would lead to legal action, Kono used the distinction between moral and legal responsibility to block legal action. In 1995, Japan's nationalist right-wing party went further. It rejected the charge of moral responsibility. It insisted that the women were willing prostitutes. In 2007, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe expressed sympathy for the comfort women and apologized for their situation, but insisted that they were not forced into slavery. In his words, "I am deeply pained to think of the comfort women who experienced immeasurable pain and suffering, a feeling I share equally with my predecessors." How the women found themselves in the situation and the source of their immeasurable pain and suffering is left unsaid. The Yomiuri Shimbun, the conservative newspaper with the largest daily circulation in Japan, said that it was inappropriate to suggest the women known as the comfort women were sex slaves who were recruited against their will. It deleted all references to the women as sex slaves in its previous reporting. The newspaper's erasure of the term sex slaves came after the United Nations rejected the Japanese government request that the UN report calling on Japan to apologize and pay compensation to the survivors be rejected. Bringing their image cleansing campaign to the United States, a group of Japanese historians and academics is urging the American publisher McGraw-Hill to, quote, correct a college textbook that they say contains many erroneous expressions about sex slaves used by Japanese soldiers during World War II. The professors insist that the women were, and I quote, simply prostitutes. McGraw-Hill rejected their request. The resolution of the comfort women remains a live diplomatic issue. In December 2015, South Korean President Park Geun-hye and Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe agreed to a final solution of the matter. Japan apologized and pledged 1 billion yen to survivors. Survivors and their advocates were not consulted. Their demands were ignored. The new president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, called the 2015 deal flawed. During a meeting with 9 victims of the camps, he apologized for the agreement, saying, quote, "I feel sorry for the fact that the deal was reached without listening to your opinions and was against your wills. I'm offering words of apology as president." Although he insisted that the comfort women controversy should not affect future relations with Japan, he ordered South Korean officials to institute measures to meet the victims' demands. It is unclear how South Korea can meet the comfort women's demand that Japan acknowledge legal, moral, and reparation responsibility for the slave camp system. The Japanese inadequate apologies make it clear that though we may feel sorry for the suffering of a prostitute, calling the comfort women prostitutes serves Japan's evasion of their legal and moral culpability. Countering Japan's strategy, the women at the tribunal called themselves sex slaves. Confirming the women's identity as sex slaves, the tribunal recognized their words as truthful and refused to accept that their wounds were self-inflicted. Refusing to be called prostitutes, the comfort women aimed at securing their right to sexual and bodily integrity. The prostitute situation, as subsequent events make clear, remains unchanged. Her status as a person is suspended. Her speech is discounted. Between the comfort women and us. The comfort women are making their case against the Japanese government by refusing the name prostitute. They insist on being identified as sex slaves. They are right. There is an important difference, an immeasurable difference, between a prostitute, a person who decides to sell sexual pleasure for profit, and a sex slave, a person who, as property of another, is sexually abused and raped to satisfy the sexual fantasies of the men who buy and own her. The difference, however, is not between an immoral person and an innocent one. Delineating the difference in this way reinforces misogynist fantasies and legitimates the politics that empowers men at the expense of women. That the comfort women could not allow themselves to be called prostitutes, even forced prostitutes, speaks to the power of this name to shame and destroy a woman. To ask the women who bore the brunt of the stigma of being identified as prostitutes to bear the burden of transforming the meaning of prostitution, to ask them to insist the prostitute has a right to be protected from sexual abuse, to ask them to demand that the human right to bodily sexual integrity be affirmed in the case of the prostitute as well as all other human beings is asking too much. Respecting their courage in speaking out, we are left with their unfinished task. What is asking too much of the comfort women is not asking too much of us. Though they found that they could only buy their dignity at the expense of the dignity of the prostitute, it is time for us to say the price of this bargain is too high. Time for us to create a world where the declaration, "I am not a prostitute," would no longer be necessary to validate the demand for justice. Thank you. Please.
Well, prostitute is a very heavily laden word in English, but I was wondering, is there a Japanese term that's equally heavily rated? In other words, were those neutrals in Japanese, and is it kind of a cross-cultural stigma?
I don't know Japanese. I do know that the Japanese government calls them prostitutes, and that when the survivors returned to Japan, they were just vilified in the streets as prostitutes.
But the English word? Oh,
No.
we don't know, okay.
I mean, it was a Japanese word.
Okay, I
Uh,
was curious about that.
yeah. Is there anyone here who knows Japanese? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that it's actually cross-cultural to that degree, that there's different words that,
Not only is it cross-cultural there, but in India, I've just been reading about the surrogate mothers there who were known as the rental homes, and they've been denigrated as prostitutes. So it carries. Yeah. Please.
Because I have to go to another lecture for my first seminar class. So before I go, I just want to say thank you because my mom's neighbor when she was young is a Chinese comfort woman from World War II. And after the war ended, she could not find jobs. No respect for her. After her husband realizing what happened to her in her previous lives, they divorced. And then people on the street, including children, call her whores without knowing what really happened. And even though she insisted that she was forced, nobody listened to her. And she was called a liar. People wrote a tomato on her, and every single time she went to market, people abused her as a defense for justice. So I just want to say thank you for sharing all of this and let more people know what really happened during World War II.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This story, the women who are still alive tell stories like this. And these are, I mean, what you need to know is these women were trafficked. They were very young. Some of them didn't know what sexual relationships were all about. We're talking about young girls. And that's why the poster that Nancy made for us is so important, because now we see the old women, but these were young, beautiful girls. And what this story brings up is that the women trafficked were in the territories that Japan colonized. So this is a story not just about women, but about, not just about vulnerable young women, but about vulnerable colonized women. And that's why so many of the women are from Korea. Korea was a Japanese colony. China, Japanese colony. Very few, if any, Japanese women were trafficked in. So that's where you get that whole. And so many of the women tell stories like this. Because the other thing about them, these were very traditional women. They wanted to have the traditional woman's life, family friendly, family, children, husband, part of a community. And they either had to lie to get the life they wanted. And they talk about how when your intimate relationships are built on a lie, they're destroyed. If they told the truth, like we heard here, they were divorced. And there's one story I know about of a woman who told the truth. Her husband, the man, married her anyway, but he abused her. And she had to be grateful that he married her. So this is it's a profound story, and it's unhappily a common story. Yeah. Please.
Thank you for mentioning the Tribunal.
I have a loud voice anyway.
Thank you for mentioning the War Tribunal for Yugoslavia, which is just closed actually, and the fact that it's the first, I mean, certainly not the first war where rape was used effectively as a crime against humanity and to terrorize and demoralize the population of the country. And even in your and I just know how things played out for women who were victims of rapes in former Yugoslavia. While there was a great public sympathy for it and so on, they were treated as damaged goods, as prospects for marriage in these very traditional, very remote parts of Yugoslavia. So this idea of there's this concept of damaged goods that is applied to women, but it's usually not applied to men.
Never.
You know, I mean, if you have stolen cigarettes in your youth, that doesn't mean that you should be killed, we generally believe. Of course, that's not true if you happen to be a black man, but, so I think that is, your arguments get to the crux of that woman who's sexually touched, whether by being a prostitute or in any other way, this is something that plays out in rape trials, whether the victim is innocent. And in so many parts of the world, whether a woman is a virgin at the time of the rape or not a virgin makes a great difference in terms of culpability of accuser. So thank you for creating that distinction.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's, the ICTY, the particular trial we worked on, was the first trial that dealt exclusively with sexual violence. And that's what made it a landmark trial, that it just flagged sexual violence as a unique crime, not just a war crime, but a crime against humanity. And then the thing they did that was radical, and that's why I see this People's Tribunal as moving in that direction. They said there is a human right to sexual integrity. Well, that right didn't exist before that tribunal issued that judgment. It's what we philosophers like to call a performative utterance. It brought something into existence that didn't exist before. In the same way that when a person of authority says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or I now pronounce you wife and wife, or I now pronounce you husband and husband, it creates a reality that didn't exist before. And so that's what this tribunal did. It created a human right, which is really no different than the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence when they said, all men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, actually they didn't. And some of them still don't. But the writers of the Declaration of Independence said, oh, that right's there, we're just letting you know about it. So that gives you a sense of the power of symbols and symbolic forms that Drusilla Cornell was talking about. If you have the power to create symbols that articulate who you want to be, that is huge. It's really big. You're tired, you're hungry, you want to go home. Thank you very much.